Hi, this is Dr. Graham, and we're going to talk today about social psychology, chapter 11. So please get your chapter lecture notes and your chapter outline out, and we're going to discuss that today. I tried to put this up on. I tried to put the lecture notes up on my video here, and it didn't quite work. So I'm a novice with this. So we're going to look at what is social psychology's focus, social thinking, social influence, and social relations. Well, in terms of social psychology's focus, the first slide here talks about or addresses the difference between social psychology and personality psychology. We're going to do personality psychology next Tuesday. You're going to find it very exciting. I'm really looking forward to doing the personality psychology chapter with you. And I will have you actually conduct what is referred to as a self-report questionnaire on what your dominant personality factor is or trait. So we will discuss that next week. But what do social psychologists look at? They use scientific methods to study how we think about, influence, and relate to one another. It's fundamentally how we relate to each other, members of our family, our social groups, and how we relate to society, how in effect how society relates to us, as well as how organizations relate to one another. Social psychology studies social forces that explains why people act differently in different situations. We will look at this in a moment. Personality psychologists, on the other hand, study personality traits or factors that explain why we act differently in a given situation. For example, with personality psychology, we are going to talk about the five dominant factors that we have, each of us have, that makes up our personality. You'll have a dominant one, and then you'll have a weak one, and you'll have the other three will be a cluster or arranged somewhere in between the dominant and the weak. Okay, and what the dominant will tell you is exactly what this statement says: is how we act in different situations, how we cope with, let's say, stress and anxiety, how we cope and prepare for how we study for exams and things of that nature. Okay, so we will do that next. We'll do that next Tuesday. Well, in the context of social thinking, we encounter something called fundamental attribution error, and this is pretty much we all do this. It's not unique to one person. It's really something that is uh, a human situation. And fundamental attribution error is defined as the tendency when analyzing others' behavior to overestimate the influence of personality and underestimate the effects of situation. So oftentimes you may say that person is acting because of who they are rather than where they are. And that's what this refers to. And it's in a case where a stranger acts badly in public. You don't know why that person is acting that way. It could be, and most likely, it's situational. If it's not situational, it's probably something related to abnormal behavior in some fashion, possibly a psychological disorder. Also, fundamental attribution error involves the aspect of having real life and social consequences. For example, the individual that joins an organization may act differently in that organization than they otherwise would act privately, or let's say in a close relationship with a loved one or just a close group of friends. Social thinking also involves attitude. Now, we've talked about attitude, excuse me, in the context of thinking when we did the chapter on thinking, intelligence, and language. So attitude most influences our behavior when? Well, we recall back from the other chapter, external influences are minimal. Our attitude is stable, attitude is specific to the behavior, and easily recalled. We may act in certain ways. Our attitude, we may act relative to how we perceive things in different ways based on our attitude about a situation, our attitude about somebody, an attitude about a group or organization. That will be evident in how we behave accordingly. Then we have something called cognitive dissonance. Now, what is cognitive dissonance? Well, the textbook says or defines it as relief from tension. Dissonance would be some fashion of discomfort. Okay, cognitive dissonance is cognitive discomfort. You have a clash of ideas, a clash of thoughts. All right, it's let's say a psychological conundrum. A conundrum is a problem, and maybe you believe you've been brought up to believe a certain way, and you find out that that way is contrary to reality. Okay, that would cause psychological dissonance, psychological discomfort. Thoughts are clashing. Okay, we're going to get into this discussion in a moment, but I'm reminded of an article I was reading yesterday about how scientists are now perceiving certain aspects of the universe. So what they first believed and were taught has now become further scientists, further physicists, let's say, have now proven that former way of thinking was not correct, that they become enlightened through further research and analysis and found out what they thought was right is no longer that way. That could cause a level of cognitive dissonance between what you thought you knew and what you now know, causing a conflict. And what happens when we have cognitive dissonance? The brain regions become active when people experience cognitive dissonance, become very active. Okay, through cognitive dissonance, we often bring attitudes into line our actions. So cognitive dissonance can be a good thing. It can be a corrective measure. And so in the context of social thinking, cognitive dissonance has both a good side and a bad side, and it's reflected in our behavior. And social psychologists will take a look at how we behave in certain situations in order to understand that behavior. The next area we want to look at is social influence. Social influence, conformity and obedience, group thinking and group influence. How do groups influence you? And then thinking critically about things such as the internet. The internet has become a social amplifier, correct? We have all kinds of social media. We have Facebook is now the most notorious, the most famous, the most used. You have Instagram. You have, excuse me, Twitter. You have LinkedIn. And there's others that I'm unaware of, but there's most likely others out there that are similar to Facebook that we use to communicate ideas, thoughts, and that emulate our behavior. All right? And the thing about the internet, what's the thing about the internet that you have to realize when you post something on Facebook or Twitter? That you can't take it back. The internet is permanent. Our communications process, our telecommunications, everything that we say back and forth, phone conversations and whatnot, actually that transmission between 2 or 3 or 4 people actually goes out into space. So it goes out in infinity in a way, so we can't take it back. Once it's said, it's out there. And you have to keep and be mindful of that and how that influences others and how others' thoughts will influence and can influence you. All right, conformity and obedience. What do we mean by that? Well, conformity and obedience involves something called automatic mimicry, which helps you to empathize and feel what others do. There's certainly a high level of empathy towards the victims of the Parkland shooting, empathy towards the victims of the crosswalk collapse at Florida International University in Miami. So those folks down in South Florida have had somewhat of a very stressful and traumatic last 45 days. And then when you add in the effects of Hurricane Irma and Harvey on the state, and particularly down in South Florida, that area has had, for the last several months, a fair share of tragedy. So automatic mimicry would help, excuse me, still suffering from my cough, people to empathize and feel as they do. And the more we, let's say, mimic and take on those feelings of those people, the greater our empathy is, and the more people tend to like us. So when you're involved with talking with someone, lean into them, show generosity, you show concern for what they're doing, and you show empathy. Like, I care and I'm interested in what you're saying. I care and I'm interested in how you're feeling. And the fact that you do care and show empathy, in a sense, you are conforming to how they are acting and behaving through empathy. So that is a matter of social influence. It can be done face to face. Most often it's done through the media, TV, and video, and through social media. Social influences conformity also involves things such as when people are more likely to conform when you are made to feel incompetent or insecure. This list that I want to read to you, that you have in front of you, goes to how organizations and groups are, how you might say political parties go, how news medias, how countries go in terms of how that group tends to want to conform us or have us conform to them. Very good in some cases, not so good in others. Okay. The first thing is, when we are dealing with conformity, is that an organization or a company or a group might make you feel incompetent or insecure, and as a result, we need them. If you're a student of history, and I hope that you are, because you have to keep in mind, history can repeat itself. So that's why we always have to be mindful of historical events. So in the instance, or an example of how we're made to feel incompetent or insecure, would be in the case such as when a government is so charismatic that it makes you feel, or a government agency makes you feel, that you can't live without their help. There's cases of history that have been this way. Dictatorships through history have made their people feel incompetent and insecure, focused on gaining their support for their dictatorship. Organizations do this. Political organizations have done it. I did it in last election cycle. They're still doing it now. You have news media that makes us feel incompetent and insecure without paying particular focus on what they're saying. You might be in a group in which everyone agrees, so we conform. You might be involved with a professional organization. Most of us here in the Department of Psychology are members of the American Psychological Association. That's a group where everyone agrees on the fundamentals of psychology. We come together and support the practice of psychology. And this goes to the third bullet. We admire the APA status and attractiveness. So you might join a professional organization for these reasons. It helps promote your profession. There's job. They publish. They have a job board you can go to look for a new job. They have outlets for further education, continuing education, conferences, seminars, all kinds of learning tools and support mechanisms to promote success in psychology. So that's why we join, and that's why you would want to join a professional organization. We may have not already committed to an organization, so we conform to the one that we like and feel most associated with. And so we conform for various reasons to an organization or to a particular thought, if you will, and it's exemplified in our behavior. And social psychologists will take a look at this to try to understand why this is. The concept of obedience through social influence occurs when an individual giving orders is in close proximity and perceived as, let's say, a legitimate authoritative figure. The President of the United States, the President of a university, principal of a high school, mom and dad, a boss, a manager. These are people in authority, and we have a tendency to obey them. A police officer, for example, in the sense that the individual giving orders is in close proximity and or perceived as, being that legitimate authority figure to follow. Authority figure is supported by a well-known institution. Of course, the President of the United States will be supported by the government of the United States. President of a university supported by the university. Father and mother by the family structure, and so on. Another way that we obey through social influence is this idea of how organizations might depersonalize us. Excuse me. For example, in the United States, each of us are supposed to have a social security number. A social security number is used in place of a name. It's used in place of an address. It's an identifier. It identifies us with the Internal Revenue Service. It identifies us to the FBI. It identifies us as it's a tracking number, if you will, which totally depersonalizes who we are as an individual. So yeah, this is a nation of numbers, and we are a number rather than a face or a name with an address to the organization. So through this mechanism, organizations exert strong social influence over us to help us and actually make us conform to situations. And sometimes this can lead to conformity to falsehoods and given into cruelty. We see this in certain family structures. We've seen this with the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. We've seen this with James Jones, who took a group of people. It's all based on each of these individuals that were in charge of these organizations being very charismatic and convincing the people that were following them that they were the next godly prophet, and that they, by following them, they would have a doorway into eternity. Was falsehood. In the case of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, there was a recent documentary on this on TV, and I strongly encourage each of you to go to YouTube, search out the Branch Davidians, and what I'm referring to, what happened in Waco, Texas a number of years ago, where they had a compound there, and it was almost a military-like compound, where I can't recall the man's name. I think his last name was Koresh. Led people to believe that he was the second coming of the Lord Jesus, and that people from all walks of life, male, female, children, followed him. And he was very charismatic, and the net result of what happened in Waco is it had been surrounded by FBI and agents from ATF, thinking that the Branch Davidians were a revolutionary type of organization, and uh, there was a gunfight between everyone. Something happened inside that caused an explosion in the building, and several of the Branch Davidian followers were killed. Okay, that's a very good example of where strong social influence can make people conform to falsehoods or give in to cruelty. It was very cruel. He had children convinced that he was uh, 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 immortal, or they were going to have immortality. He had several wives, not just adult wives, children wives, and he had social and personal control over them. And so obedience can be seen in many ways. And what I want you to do is begin to think about this in your own life and think about how um, your behavior is when you are influenced in such a way. Certainly, as we grow up in a family, we uh, allow ourselves to have that for our mom and dad to control us as we get older, and it's a normal way of showing our obedience to our family. We typically are obedient to family members. We stick together. We have a close relationship. It's founded on base commonality. It's founded on love, commonality, uh, and the family structure. But if that family structure gets out of hand, for example, in the famous interaction between the Hatfields and McCoys, which was made into a motion picture, I believe it took place in the early part of the 19th century. Two families in Appalachia were feuding, and the family members conformed and were obedient to each family structure, regardless if one or two were empathized with the other family member or two. That even caused friction and became more of a problem. So these are examples, real world examples that we can see. Governments that seek obedience in terms of our rule of law. So there's the social psychologists will take a look at all of this in terms of how this affects how we behave. All right. Now, social influence also includes something called social loafing. Now, each of you may have already encountered an instance of social loafing, which is defined as the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pooling their efforts towards attaining a common goal. This occurs when you're put into a team, all right, or a group. You will have opportunities while you're here at Georgia State or other academic institutions to be in a team for a class assignment. And that class assignment may be doing some type of research and then publishing. What I mean by publishing is doing a report, doing a paper report, and then presenting that report to the class. All right. So let's say there's 5 people on your team or in your group. Each of you have, let's say for argument's sake, a chapter that you're responsible for the group or team report. And in order to compile the data and information for your chapter, it requires you to conduct a project of some kind, and each chapter is a portion of that project. Where the social loafing comes in is when 1 or 2 of your team or group members doesn't participate, and the other members of the group or team have to carry their load, do their job for them. Okay? Now, there's different reasons why that could occur. It could occur because oftentimes it occurs as a result of those team members that don't want to participate do so because they expect you to do it for them, and they have other things better to do than to do that work. Okay? Or acting as a part of a group and feeling less accountable. When you're in a group structure, there is somewhat of a protection basis. The whole group fails, the whole group succeeds. All right? uh, that individual or those individuals that don't participate may feel that their contribution won't matter. They also may have some anxiety, some social anxiety, where participating in groups and teams causes them to be overly anxious, overly stressed, and they have a hard time in talking. They become very timid and introvert-like because they're fearful of making a mistake. If they say something, it may be wrong, or you may perceive it as being wrong, and you become criticized. And there's a fear of that, so they won't participate. Then you have the situation where an individual or two may take total advantage when there's a lack of identification within the group. Let me give you an example of what I'm referring to. When I was at the University of South Florida the second time working on my MBA, we had a class project, and I was in a team of five, myself and 4 other guys. Each of us had an assignment, a portion of a project to complete, and then write about it, and then put it all together to make a contribution to the team, and then select 1 or 2 of us to make the presentation of our project results. There was one team member who didn't participate. He felt like taking advantage of the team because he felt that he was actually better than us. He had been a former minor league baseball player. He had an opportunity to play Major League Baseball, hurt his pitching arm, and was feeling he had an attitude issue. He would come to class occasionally. He would occasionally participate in our group and team meetings off campus, but most of the time he would not. And it got to a point to where the remaining 4 of us, decided that we had to do his work. Because here is the caveat. In a group and team environment such as that, the whole group gets the grade, not an individual. So in order to get an A, in order to have an A on each of our grades for that course, we all collectively had to earn an A. So what that meant is we had to do his work for him in order to get an A. Well, of course, that results in some animosity and some resentment. But he was loafing. He deliberately social loafed through that whole semester. Now, the faculty recognized it. They understood it. They had to address it with that individual separately. And of course, he wasn't too happy with the grade that he received, and he understood why after the faculty addressed it with him. But you get social loafing even in the workplace, and it occurs most often in the workplace where you're in a team environment and 1 or 2 people are having to do all the work, and you may be in that situation. Then we have the situation of de-individuation, which is the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint occurring in group situations that foster arousal and amenities. For example, a perfectly law-abiding individual might participate in a disruptive march down Main Street and lose their individuality while gaining anonymity as a result of what the group does. They may not actually participate in any kind of destructive actions, but they are involved in it as a member of the group, and they will conform and allow that group to influence their behavior. Okay, it's the same way when, for example, if you're in a group of 4, 5, 6 people, and you get to acting up, you may normally not act that way if you're by yourself or outside of the group. So you all know and have examples that you've seen where this occurs. So again, this is another case of social influence. Social influence also involves polarization. If a group is like-minded, discussion strengthens existing opinions. Polarization is when you have, let's say, a viewpoint, a certain political viewpoint or social viewpoint or cultural viewpoint or whatever it might be. Okay, and you won't consider any other points. That you're polarized on that one simple, like-minded uh, uh, concept, idea, viewpoint, whatever it might be. Okay? It's polarization. You have polarization within political organizations. You have polarization within political parties. You have polarization within organizations, and you've had examples of this in your own lives where you can see it and feel it. You might be involved in it. That's again another situation of social influence. Then you have this thing called groupthink. Groupthink is where you go along with how the group thinks. It's that simple. It's a mode of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in a decision-making group overrides realistic appraisals of alternatives. Okay? Where you get groupthink often, and I use my experience in the business world as an example, you're on a team and you've been just assigned to a team, and oftentimes teams at work can be a dozen and a half people or much larger. All right? And you're sitting around a conference table discussing the project, and you have a team leader, a project manager or group team lead, and they will have most likely a handful of compadres, you might call them, people that will support their view, go with what they say all the time, and promote what the team lead's views are. You may sit there and listen to the argument of how to approach the solution to the project or the problem with a perfectly good idea and much better. But because you're new or not associated or in that little group around the project lead, you go ahead and coalesce and agree to the group think on how to approach the project. This happens in a lot of places, in a lot of situations. And we're going to talk about social relations. This involves prejudice, aggression, attraction, altruism, conflict, and peacemaking. Now, I want to mention to you that there's all kinds of different ways that we can be prejudiced. All right? Let me give you an example. I don't have any windows in this office, and I'm prejudiced because I love to see the outside. If I had a choice, I would want an office with windows. So I'm prejudiced against an office without windows. All right? I don't think I look good in the color pink. Now, my fiance says I would look good, but I'm very hesitant. Okay? Pink is not a color that I like necessarily. So I have a preponderance to be prejudiced towards that color pink. Now, I like pink flowers. I love pink roses. I love to give her pink roses. But I, for one, don't like the color pink. I'm a little prejudiced against the color pink, if you might, or pink cars for guys, things like that. Okay. When I played baseball, I had a particular bat or style of bat that I was comfortable with. I did not want to use other bats. I was prejudiced against other bats. I wanted to use my bat and my bat style. Okay. Well, prejudice also involves. And prejudice means prejudgment. We prejudge. We have we already make a decision about a thing or a person or a group or a country or wherever it might be, a food, a style, whatever it might be, on a prejudgment basis. And it's an unfair negative attitude towards some group, something, some person, something. Okay? Social psychologists look at prejudice as how it targets different cultural, ethical, or gender groups. But believe me, ladies and gentlemen, prejudice involves so much more. And there's good sides of it, and certainly there's bad sides of it, okay? Now, the components of prejudice are these: beliefs, emotion, and predisposition to discriminate. These begin at home, they begin in your social groups, they begin in where you live, all right? And we have all kinds of examples of how the components of prejudice impact our way of life and our behavior and what we say and what we manifest and how we act, okay? So The social psychologist is looking at prejudice through the eyes of social relations and trying to understand these interactions and these behaviors as a result of a belief system, emotions, and their predisposition to make judgment. Okay? Excuse me. Now, the social roots of prejudice involve something called the idea, I should say, of social inequities, which have often developed attitudes that justify the status quo, which means justify their particular belief. We have just world phenomenon, which is good is rewarded and evil is punished. Now, this is an example of how prejudice is positive in terms of national support. During the First and Second World Wars, it was the good guys versus the bad guys, right? The good guys versus the bad guys. We were the good guys. The enemy, in the case of the Second World War, was Nazi Germany, and then eventually Japan. They were our enemies. Okay, they were conceived and they were perceived as being evil. They were the bad dudes. We were the good dudes. So we had the good versus evil. So there was prejudice during the Second World War, and your grandparents, perhaps maybe even your parents' age, when they were growing up in their teens, 20s, and 30s, they'd go to the movies to watch the news before TV. Okay, and the newsreels were all in black and white, and they would present the Germans and the Japanese and their allies in a very negative way, as being evil, as being bad. So there was a prejudice built up against them as being the bad guys. Okay, look at the premise behind the movie Star Wars: good versus evil. The good guys are Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Force. The bad guys are Darth Vader and the Emperor. Good versus evil. There's prejudice between the two groups, right? So that's an example of how of the type of prejudice that can work in our favor. There's prejudice amongst school rivalry teams, right? Georgia State is in a football conference. They all have a team or two, a school that they just don't get along with. They don't like. So we're prejudiced. We don't like that school for whatever reason. Okay? That's sports. In soccer, if you follow international soccer at all, there is a great deal of prejudice between teams, even within the United Kingdom, within England. There's prejudice against those teams, and then you have all the other teams in all of Europe, South America, Africa, Caribbean, all the places they play soccer. There is conflict. It's us versus them, and you can see it by the reactions of fans when their team loses. They riot, they tear down things, they burn things, they destroy things. And so, you know, the roots of prejudice, the social psychologists will dig down into the weeds, if you will, to try to find out what's the essence of why they're prejudiced. Okay? And then, of course, we have group prejudice. Through social identities, people associate themselves in such a way with one group or another. Okay? So, I just want you to know that there's different kinds of prejudice and how it affects us in so very many ways. Now, the emotional roots of prejudice involve something called scapegoat theory. Now, scapegoat theory proposes that when things go wrong, you find someone to blame. You find someone to blame. You pick somebody out that doesn't look like the rest of the crowd, and you blame that individual. All right? I spent 4 years in Europe and 2 years in Canada. My dad was in the military. And I can tell you firsthand that I was prejudiced about being an American citizen. The 4 years I lived in Europe, people didn't like me or my brothers, because we were Americans. They didn't know us. They didn't ask us who we were. They didn't ask us our name, where we came from. When we went to Canada, went to high school in Canada, football coach says, you know, we don't like you. And I said, well, why? You don't know me. You know, I'm out here this is my school. I want to play on the football team, make the team. He says, well, Americans before you thought they were better than us, left a bad taste in our mouth, and so we just assume all of y'all are alike. Of course, he's wrong. Okay? And so, in a way, we experienced the scapegoat theory that they blamed us for everything somebody else had done before us. All right? And then you have the situation where prejudice levels tend to be high among economically frustrated people. Yeah, there's financial and economic prejudice. Those on the lower end of the income scale are prejudiced against those at the higher, and vice versa. We see this reflected in society all the time, where the people that live in the very elite, expensive areas of a community seem to have a prejudiced viewpoint on everyone else that doesn't live there. And so there's economic and financial aspects of prejudice. All right? And then that leads to how we behave and how we react to different lifestyles and people. Then we have the cognitive roots of prejudice. You know, we as humans, we categorize people by minority identity, and I don't like the word minority. I prefer just by identity. I would redo this. I would say humans categorize people by identity, period. And we do so on a natural basis. If you're, let's say, from Southeast Asia, you have an identity. You have an identity print. If you're from India, you have an identity print. If you're from South America, you have an identity print. You know what I mean? If you're from Northern Europe, you have an identity print, etc. All right? So we recognize different nationalities, if you will, by that identity print. All right? Well, we have a tendency as being human to form identity categories. All right? And we also categorize people in terms of, and let's say use sports, because sports is a great analogy of life. All right? If you're an Atlanta Falcons fan or an Atlanta Braves fan or whatever the team is that you like, college, professional, we have an identity. We have that team identity. So we categorize by team identity as well, by national identity, by cultural and social identity. This is how we categorize. We do this normally as a natural aspect of being human. So, taking football, for example, you all are familiar with the Southeastern Conference. That's 20-some teams in the southeastern United States, divided into two divisions, West and East. And in the East Division, we have schools like Tennessee, Georgia, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, Florida, and there is an us versus them that's very strong within the Southeastern Conference and the teams that play one another within divisions as well as across divisions. And you get this way in baseball, okay, and other sports, all right? But back to football, let's say, it's us versus them type of identity that when that opposing team comes into your town, into your stadium, you don't like them. You want to beat them bad. And that's what we're referring to this. Okay? Then I want to talk about aggression, the biology of aggression. When you take abnormal psychology, if you have a chance to do so, I highly recommend that you do. You're going to get introduced into what manifests aggression psychologically, and what different kinds of psychological disorders are fundamentally founded on aggression. Okay? Well, aggression can be a result of genetics, a genetic influence, something genetically in our brain that causes you to be violent. Okay? It could be a viral or bacterial problem that affects the biochemical aspects of the brain that has a tendency to make you irritable, assertive, impulsive, and violent. All right? And you have neural influences, how the brain interacts with itself, okay, that may provoke aggression. All right? So there's a biological aspect of aggression. All right? And there's social, cultural aspects of aggression. For example, we have frustration. We have the frustration aggression principle. Frustration creates anger, which can spark aggression. Frustration in the summertime. The people in Puerto Rico, for a lot of those folks, they haven't had electricity for numbers of weeks and months now since the hurricane. Their frustration could easily turn into anger, which would then turn into aggression. Okay? Hot temperatures, physical pain, personal insults between folks, foul odors, a blast of cigarette smoke in your face if you're not a smoker, crowding. All of these kinds of things are actions that stimulate anger that can be manifested into aggression. And you take it out on somebody close to you. Take it out on your spouse, your family, your children, or a stranger. Now, the media does an excellent job of helping us in this way. Helping us, I don't mean in a good way. Okay? There's media models for violence. Repeatedly viewing on-screen violence tends to lessen the sensitivity to cruelty and teaches social scripts. When you're seeing something like this video is two-dimensional. Pardon me. It's two-dimensional. So the video, movies, TV shows, video games, all two-dimensional, and there is a loss of sense of reality when you see a motion picture or a video or TV program or play a video game where people are dying, because it's fictional. It's not real. The problem is that it provides a model that if you play that game enough, you watch that TV or those types of movies enough, you might you might lose a sense of reality and begin thinking that what you see on the screen is real. Okay? And of course, when we talk about abnormal psychology, we address this. Okay? Now, research confirms that people sometimes imitate what they have viewed. So there's a mimicry aspect. Okay? In the case of what happened in South Florida, the case of what happened in Austin, Texas with the bombings, one of the TV analysts suggested he was concerned about copycats. That's mimicking. That is imitating what somebody else has done so they can do the same thing somewhere else to some other people or somebody. Okay, then there's the aspect of viewing explicit sexual violence being linked to sexual violence against women and or children. Okay? They see it as a model. Other people get away with it. That looks cool. Whatever the case might be, I want to do it. And so it happens. Now, to finalize our discussion today, something I like to talk about in terms of attraction. What attracts us to that person, that significant other? Well, it's called the psychology of attraction. It involves three fundamental aspects: proximity, how close we are to them, the distance; physical attractiveness, are they hot looking? Do they, am I interested in the color of their hair, their eyes, their body structure? Do they make me go crazy, say, when I look at them in a good way? And then similarity in terms of interest, beliefs, attitude, education, religion, age, family structure, all those, economic status. So all those have to work in order for there to be an attraction. Okay? Now the first step in physical attraction or in attraction is romantic love. You have a slide there that shows a archaeological excavation outside of Rome, Italy, where they uncovered a couple that's supposed to be between 5 and 6,000 years old, and they're calling it the Romeo and Juliet uh, uh, site. All right, it's an encounter of two people, and it depicts passionate love. Passionate love is a two-factor theory of emotion where we are attracted physically to that other person. Okay? It involves physical arousal and cognitive appraisal. We like the way that person looks, we're physically aroused, and we have the cognitive appraisal thinking. Man, that person's hot, that person's good looking, I like the way they look, when they talk, when they act. And then arousal comes out of that in terms of sexual desire and a growing attachment. It's the baseline fundamental aspect of relationship. Okay? But here's the thing. Romantic love, passionate love, seldom doesn't last a lifetime. It takes work in order for that to occur. Because if you remember back to Maslow's hierarchy of Maslow's hierarchy, that the first three levels is what we want. You have basic human needs, then we have our education, then we have our family. Okay? When we're young, or just starting out, young in terms of a relationship, you have physical attractiveness. It's just the two of you, and you have passionate love, and that gives way to, let's say, marriage, more passionate love, and then children. Children, job, career, all those things begin to become the focal point of a mid-adult life with a family, and passionate love gets pushed to the side, not because they want to, but it's because they just don't simply have time. They come home, they have dinner, take care of the kids. By that time, your 10, 11 o'clock comes around, maybe later, you're exhausted and you're in bed because you got to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning. Okay? Attraction and sexual desire endure oftentimes in something called companionate love, but not in the same format as they started out in. Companionate love is the process where we are a partnership, where there's an equity involvement on each person involved. It's self-disclosure which deepens intimacy. It's the marital version of best friends forever based on trust. Think about what constitutes your best friend. Who is your best friend? They have your back, don't you? They have your six. Your best friend is that individual that you can trust completely. You can tell that individual anything. And they don't pass judgment. They may get upset, and they're going to tell you what they think, but you know they're always going to be there for you. They're going to support you. They're going to care deeply for you. They'll cry with you. They'll laugh with you. And they're there for the rest of your life. Well, folks, companionate love is just that. Is the opportunity to find an individual that you can go through life with, and a partnership that's basically and fundamentally your best friend forever. Okay? To where, in cases you've seen, it's the old couple where one dies, the next one dies within hours or days of the other one. Okay? That's what companionate love is. All right? It's very hard to get. We all aspire to it. Then we have altruism. Altruism is the unselfish concern for the welfare of others. We have the bystander intervention. It's when you notice something going on, you take action. You don't think of yourself. You think of the people in harm's way. You assume responsibility for helping, and you go do it. That's bystander intervention. Okay? We have different kinds of norms for helping others. Socialization norm, social expectation that prescribes how we should behave. We have a society that promotes helping one another. We do this around holidays, We do this around disasters. We do this when we hear of somebody needing something, we do it. The reciprocity norm is the expectation that people respond favorably to someone that's reached out to them. You move it, it used to be when I was growing up, of course I grew up in a military family, this was often the case. You move into a new neighborhood, you don't know anybody, and you get a knock at the door and there's a mom or a couple moms there with pasta and salads and pie for the family. You do this when someone has died or when there's a, and the neighbor helping neighbor. That's a reciprocity norm in a way. We help one another. Change a tire for somebody, next thing you know, they're helping you with mowing your grass. And then we have the social responsibility norm, expectation that people should help those who depend on them. We do this with the soup kitchens and whatnot, okay? We do this with our elderly. We do this with people that have a problem, a physical problem in taking care of themselves. And then lastly, we have the conflict and peacemaking aspect of social psychology, all right? We have this enemy perception, us versus them, okay? It's a vicious cycle of hostility emerges at individual or national level. We spoke about this earlier, okay? But it should hopefully give way to the promotion of peace. Now, Kofi Annan won the Nobel Prize in 2001. I believe Kofi was he was either the Secretary General of the UN or I think he was the Secretary General of the UN. I could be corrected. And for those of you who are generally interested, check on this for me and then enlighten me. But Kofi Annan said, most of us have overlapping identities which unite us with every different group. Most of us have overlapping identities which unite us, commonalities. We can love what we are without hating what and who we are not. We can thrive in our own tradition as we learn from others. The concept of peacemaking, of promoting peace, where research indicates that in cases of conflict and cooperation can be transformational. It's president reaching across the aisle to shake hands with another president. One leader shaking hands with another leader, showing that, hey, we come from different lands, different groups, different organizations, different cultures, different belief systems, but we can find commonality and work together for the benefit of both of us. So social psychologists work on all these factors. I know I probably took a little extra time today, but I trust that this has been a delightful video. I encourage you to pay attention, do the chapter outline, and I will see you next time.